Welcome to the Poetry Project. I'm William Page, and today we're going to look at Shakespeare's 29th sonnet. Before we get into it, I want to make an observation about Shakespeare and the nature of his genius. Shakespeare was not an innovator. The blank verse form that he perfected in his plays was taken from other playwrights. Christopher Marlowe in 1593, the year he was murdered, was generally considered to be Shakespeare's superior as a poetic dramatist. In that year, Shakespeare would have been 29 and had not yet written any of his greatest plays. This would have been in the middle of what is called his early period. He had written the Henry VI trilogy, Titus Andronicus, and the Comedy of Errors, and a few other plays. Shakespeare also didn't invent the stories of most of his great plays. For instance, earlier versions of Hamlet and King Lear existed, and the framework of the stories of Julius Caesar and Coriolanus were taken from Plutarch. His genius was not in inventing new forms or in creating new stories, but in taking existing forms and stories and, for the lack of a better word, making them Shakespearean. He imbued stories with drama, life, and unforgettable characters. To this day, the blank verse in his plays is considered unmatched. The same is true of his sonnets. The Shakespearean sonnet, despite being forever coupled with his name, was not invented by him. Though he used a different rhyme scheme, the first sonnets in English were written by Sir Thomas Wyatt. The first Shakespearean sonnets, with the 3 quatrains of alternating rhyming lines and a rhyming couplet at the end, were first written by Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. What Shakespeare did was make us care about sonnets. Let's be clear. The sonnet form is very confining for a poet. It's difficult to create a world in such a short space with such a circumscribed form, yet Shakespeare does it with a kind of natural ease, so that when we hear the poem or see it on the page, we think, well, that isn't so difficult after all. But of course we are wrong. It's a bit like when we see a great actor and they seem not to be acting at all. The seeming simplicity is part of the genius. So what I want to do here is go through the sonnet twice and offer 2 different interpretations and hopefully demonstrate how both work. This is interpretation number 1. The first quatrain can be seen as a statement of the problem. When in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate. In the first line we learn that the poet has been marginalized by his friends, and that his fortune has taken a hit. In the second line we learn that he is, in modern terms, depressed and alone. In the third line we learn that his prayers and cries to heaven have gone unanswered. And in the fourth, that he has looked at his life and found it lacking. In the second quatrain, we find out what is behind his melancholy, and it turns out that he is envious of others. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. In the fifth line, we find that he wishes that he could be more hopeful. In the sixth, we find that he wishes he was more handsome and had more friends. In the seventh, that he desires to possess another man's artistry and desires a more expansive perspective. The eighth line is a summing up. With what I most enjoy, contented least. Now we are ready to move on. The third quatrain begins with, yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising. Almost is the key word here. The transformation is next. Happily I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. So the poet, when he thinks of his love, recovers his good spirit and his mood changes. The catalyst for the transformation is simply the thought of his love. I think on thee. And the poet describes the change with the beautiful image of the rising lark. The couplet doesn't introduce anything new, but instead reinforces the thought behind the transformation. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. The feeling that the poet experiences when he remembers his love is so ecstatic that he prefers it to the feeling of power and majesty that is reserved for a king. In interpretation number 2, we're going to borrow a thematic device from Petrarch. We are not certain whether or not Shakespeare knew of Petrarch's sonnets. We know next to nothing of Shakespeare's literary influences. We can make some educated guesses from his work, but we have no accounts from friends and nothing in Shakespeare's own hand. In any case, I'm going to guess that he did have some knowledge of Petrarch's sonnets because they were translated into English by Sir Thomas Wyatt, the same Thomas Wyatt who was the first to write sonnets in English. Wyatt died 20 years before Shakespeare's birth. But we have to assume that anybody in Shakespeare's time, including Shakespeare, who wrote sonnets, would know something of Wyatt and through him of Petrarch. The idea in Petrarch is that Laura, his love, represented something more than an individual woman, that his love for her was a vehicle for the perception, or as he says, the nobility of his soul. This was part of the tradition of the poems of courtly love. The tradition often began with a physical desire for a woman, but for reasons of her being chaste or her being married to another man, Laura was in fact already married, there can be no physical consummation. And since his love is unattainable and beautiful and virtuous, the poet is inspired to contemplate her image as a kind of perfected beauty that can only exist in God or in the poet's soul. Shakespeare's sonnets are more grounded than Petrarch's, but I think it would be extraordinary to think that he didn't know of this tradition and exploit it for his own aims, especially as he makes fun of it in Sonnet 130. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. And then later he says, I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. So let's re-examine our sonnet. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. In the first line, we must remember that fortune in Elizabethan times is more likely to mean destiny than worldly means. It had a broader meaning than the most common American definition of monetary value. So here we are going to say that the poet feels that he has a disgraceful destiny and that the men around him see it. So let's move on. I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate. In lines 2 through 4, we learn that he laments his state. We must remember that we are talking about a state of mind, or perhaps it's better to say a lower part of his identity, which is characterized by lamenting, crying out to heaven, and cursing his life. In line 3, it's important to note that Shakespeare doesn't refer to heaven as absent, but as deaf. In other words, he's saying that there is a heaven, only that it chooses to ignore his pleas. The word heaven will be repeated later on, which we will get to. He also implies that he believes in his fate, but that at present he finds it burdensome. So what do we have in this first stanza? Really, it is a very relatable moment for all of us. When we have a bad day, when everything goes wrong, how often do we lament and curse out loud and blame others or heaven for our woes? We may not want to admit, as Shakespeare does, that this part of us exists, but I doubt there are any of us who are so holy as to be able to always rise above such moments. In many ways, the second quatrain tells us more about Shakespeare than almost any passage that I can think of. By telling us what he lacks or desires, he tells us something about who he is. Maybe. Of course, we never know with Shakespeare. It's always possible that the poet in the sonnets is a character. And even though I think Shakespeare would be capable, that is, talented enough to do this, I kind of doubt that that is the case. So let's look at it. Can we say, for instance, that wishing me like to one more rich in hope means that Shakespeare was essentially a pessimist? The plays certainly suggest as much. Does featured like him with friends possessed, mean that he was unhappy with the way he looked and that he wished he possessed an easier manner around people? This seems to me to be a typical writer's malady. So maybe. Does desiring this man's art and that man's scope mean that Shakespeare was envious of other playwrights? I doubt that this is the case. By the time he was writing the sonnets, he had written Romeo and Juliet and maybe Hamlet. So he had, by this time, surpassed his contemporaries by quite a distance. But he was also an actor, and certainly not one of the best in the company. It is known, for instance, that in Hamlet he played not Hamlet, or the king, or even Horatio, but the ghost. So maybe it is this art that he is referring to. Really, to understand the first 7 lines through the lens of this theme, we need to think that Shakespeare here is lamenting the limitations of his being. He is describing an imperfect self in an imperfect world, a self that is envious, melancholy, and given to fits of anger. It is a self in which he finds only disappointment, a self that ruins the joy he should feel about his natural talents and dispositions. With what I most enjoy, contented least. The 9th line here again is the turning point. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. So let's re-examine the transformation. Happily I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. Now what we have to imagine here is that the thee in the 10th line refers not to a human companion, but to God, his soul's perception, or whatever name or phrase we think that Shakespeare might give to a higher world in which he was privy. We need to also note that this is the 2nd time we hear the word heaven. In the first quatrain, he complains that heaven is deaf. Here he is saying that he sings hymns at heaven's gate. Quite a transformation. In the image of the lark, we also have, as a contrast to heaven, sullen earth. This is a wonderful phrase because sullen sums up his earlier state, and matching it with earth implies the imperfect world we mentioned earlier. The other repeated word here is state. In any interpretation, we have to believe that this sonnet, as well as many of the others, is about a transformation from an unpleasant state to an almost ecstatic state. The word state will also be repeated for a 3rd time in the couplet. Then I scorn to change my state. State of mind is probably too weak an interpretation. I believe he is talking about a complete change of perspective. Here's the couplet. For thy sweet love remembered such a wealth brings that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Here again we need to believe that the word thy refers not to the good love of a man or a woman, but to God, or the love engendered by the poet's soul. It is this love that infuses his state with such energy that he scorns to change it for the pomp and luxury of kings. Maybe because Shakespeare was such a keen psychologist, nobody gets into the inner worlds of his characters better than he does. We tend not to think of him as a metaphysical poet, as we do, for instance, of Blake or John Donne. But Shakespeare is enormous in his scope of human experiences, and that must, since they are part of our adventure here, include transcendental states. Many of his plays depend on fateful coincidences or figures from other worlds. The story of Macbeth would not work without the witches, and the plot of Hamlet revolves around the word of a ghost. And there is certainly metaphysics in Hamlet's temperament. Shakespeare can show us a world devoid of otherworldly influences, In plays like Titus Andronicus and King Lear, he paints a dark and bleak vision of humanity. Those plays are usually redeemed by a few honest and courageous characters who make their way through his soulless landscape without losing their goodness. It is also interesting to note that one of Shakespeare's major themes in the sonnet series, the shortness of life, is absent here. Not that the sonnet isn't a fully realized poem. I mention it only to say that if the sonnets are read together in sequence, that theme will reinforce the need to place our love outside the realm of human attachments. Of course, both these interpretations work, and I'm sure there are different interpretations that others will find that will work for them. It is one of the elements of great poetry that it can support multiple meanings. But once you understand the courtly love tradition that Shakespeare was responding to, you'll find it in many of the other sonnets. It is an amazing group of 154 poems, and it certainly surpasses the tradition. Shakespeare, as Matthew Arnold said, was free. He did what he wanted, using the tradition when it suited him, perfecting it, making fun of it, or simply ignoring it. Arnold also gives us this line about Shakespeare. He made the heaven of heavens his dwelling place. Here's the whole sonnet. When, in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, happily I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. This channel will never be popular by YouTube standards, which means we will get no help from them. We are dependent on our friends to get the word out. So if you like what we are doing here and want to see more, let us know and send a link to a friend.